Finally, Nicole Kidman surfaces in public after ditching Keith Urban. And honey, we have been through it. So here's the timeline. Ready? It's happening right now. For 19 long years, Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman were Hollywood's favorite little trophy of "See, love can survive here." They owned red carpets, raised 2 kids in Nashville, and somehow survived a disaster in their first few months of marriage that would have nuked any normal couple before the honeymoon glow faded. Then boom, autumn 2025, the whole thing exploded. The split announcement hit like a freight train, not because there were no red flags, but because everyone had gaslit themselves into believing this marriage had already dodged its worst bullets. Cue the public going full detective mode, combing through old footage for clues. And guess what kept popping up? A speech Urban gave just over a year before the breakup. A speech where he admitted stuff most dudes would rather swallow glass than say out loud. A speech that, when you play it back after everything fell apart, hits completely different. So here's the whole messy saga. How they met, what Urban confessed, and what really torched it all. They first locked eyes in January 2005 at the Day USA Gala in LA, that annual Aussie talent showcase. Urban later gushed like a lovesick puppy, saying he felt like he'd snuck into the royal ball when he spotted Kidman, calling her a literal princess with some otherworldly glow. The guy was so wrecked that he kept her phone number in his pocket for over a week before growing a pair and dialing. That kind of hesitation from a man who'd already played to thousands of fans? Yeah, it told you exactly how serious he was. When he finally called, things went warp speed. They dated, got engaged by May 2006, and tied the knot on June 25th that same year in a Carmelite ceremony at the Cardinal Siri Memorial Chapel in Sydney. Guests called it intimate and actually joyful, with Kidman's adopted kids from her previous marriage right there. From the outside, it looked like the dream life they'd both been chasing. But what almost nobody knew? Trouble was already brewing underneath. Urban had done rehab twice before the wedding and had admitted for years that he struggled with alcohol and substance use. But here's where it gets juicy. Urban's own confession, which he dropped years later with brutal honesty, was that those earlier trips to rehab had fixed exactly nothing. He'd just faked the whole "I'm fine" routine without ever touching the real demons that started the mess in the first place. So barely 4 months after saying "I do" in Sydney, the whole damn house of cards came crashing down. In October 2006, Urban checked into the Betty Ford Center and stayed for about 3 months. 4 months married, 3 months in treatment. Zero clue if his relationship would still be breathing when he walked out. What Kidman did during that nightmare? It tells you everything about her. She bailed on press duties for the film Fur. She stayed completely out of the public chatter. No dramatic press releases, no carefully polished statements for the media. She just poured every ounce of energy into being there for her husband during the darkest chapter of his life. A choice Urban would later call the single most important act of love he'd ever seen. Insiders close to the pair back then said her decision to stay wasn't some weak, passive move. It was calculated, done with all that outside noise screaming at her, and with zero guarantee of how any of it would end. When Urban finally got out of treatment and the marriage somehow found solid ground again, both of them knew the foundation underneath them now was nothing like the one they'd started with. It was tougher, rawer, and forged from something genuinely painful. And for the next 18 years, that foundation held. They built a life in Nashville, welcomed 2 daughters, Sunday Rose in 2008 and Faith Margaret in 2010, and became famous in Hollywood for the deliberate, almost obsessive way they guarded their relationship. Both of them openly talked about the rules they'd set. One of the biggest? A strict cap on how many days they'd ever let themselves be apart. So here's how they tried to beat the odds. Whenever tours or film shoots created distance, the rule was simple. One of them jumps on a plane to close the gap instead of letting it fester. Keith Urban also picked up a little habit, calling Nicole Kidman during his encore every single night. A short, cheesy ritual that kept things real while he was sweating in front of thousands. Kidman, for her part, made it crystal clear that family was non-negotiable. She straight up turned down roles if they meant being away from their daughters too long. These weren't just sweet ideas. They were active, deliberate moves by two people who knew exactly what happens when distance gets ignored. Then came the speech that broke the internet. April 2024, Kidman was getting the 49th AFI Life Achievement Award at the Dolby Theater in Hollywood. Urban grabbed the mic and delivered words that froze the room. He talked about meeting her at that 2005 gala, keeping her number in his pocket for over a week, how fast their lives tangled up once he finally called. And then he went to a place most celebrities never dare. He described no sugarcoating, the first months of their marriage. And here's what he said, words that have been replayed a million times. We got married in June 2006, and barely 4 months into our marriage, my addictions that I had done really nothing about blew our marriage to smithereens, and I went into the Betty Ford Center for 3 months. He kept going. 4 months into a marriage, I'm in rehab for 3 months with no idea what was going to happen to us. And if you want to see what love and action really looks like, give that a whirl. Then he praised Kidman directly, saying she pushed through every negative voice, including, he suspected, some of her own, and chose love. Her capacity to love, he said, is like no one I've ever met. Cameras inside the theater caught Kidman visibly emotional, wiping away tears. The audience, from what everyone said, went dead silent during the most personal parts. By the next morning, that clip had exploded across entertainment media worldwide. People called it one of the most emotionally naked moments they'd ever seen from a public figure about their own marriage. But now, looking back at that speech with the benefit of hindsight, knowing what came next, the whole thing feels complicated. The words were real. The emotion wasn't fake. And yet, barely over a year later, the couple had split. Reports confirmed by TMZ in late September 2025 revealed that Kidman and Urban had been living apart since the summer of that year. Urban had reportedly moved out of the family home outside Nashville and was renting a separate place. Sources close to Nicole Kidman described her as someone who genuinely didn't see the breakup coming in the form it took and who had been quietly trying to patch things up while the distance between them kept growing like a bad weed. One so-called insider yapped to Fox News Digital that every sign pointed to Keith Urban having already checked out, and separately confirmed that the gossip was swirling around Nashville long before it went public. Kidman pulled the trigger on September 30th, 2025, filing for divorce in a Nashville court, citing the classic, irreconcilable differences. The whole mess finally got nailed shut on January 6, 2026. When the settlement details leaked from court documents, they screamed exactly the kind of neat private agreement that defined how these two always handled their public image. Kidman was named primary parent. Daughters Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret would live with her for 306 days a year. Urban gets them every other weekend. Neither asked for alimony, and child support was set at a big fat zero. Both parents agreed to share major decisions about the girls' lives, healthcare, education, the whole deal. One juicy clause said neither parent can trash the other or their family, and both must encourage the daughters to keep loving relationships with both mom and dad. In fancy legal language, it was a structured and cooperative arrangement. But let's call it what it really was, the funeral of something that lasted nearly 2 decades. Kidman finally broke her silence about the divorce in March 2026, talking to Variety while promoting her upcoming Prime Video series Scarpetta. She chose every word like she was defusing a bomb. She called 2025 the year she went quiet, admitting, "I was in my shell." When asked if she was doing okay, her answer was pure vintage Kidman, the way she's always handled public pain. "I am because I'm always going to be moving toward what's good. What I'm grateful for is my family, and keeping them as is and moving forward. That's that. Everything else I don't discuss out of respect. I'm staying in a place of we are a family, and that's what we'll continue to be." She got warm talking about Sunday and Faith, calling them her darlings, noting how they've suddenly turned into young women. There was grief buried in everything she didn't say, and pure steel in what she did. She'd gone through something brutally painful in private while somehow still working, parenting, and clinging to that dignity that's always been her brand. Keith Urban, meanwhile, was having his own little meltdown. His upcoming reality series, The Road, filmed before the split went public, shows him whining about the loneliness of tour life, admitting he often felt disconnected from the people he loved most while performing night after night in random cities. Sources close to him whispered that he knew the pressure of their separate careers played a huge role in the marriage falling apart, and that he understood this wasn't a one-person blame game. That big confession he made at the AFI Gala about how his addictions nearly torched the relationship right after it started now casts a much darker shadow than it did in the moment. What sounded like a survival story in hindsight looks more like a window into the massive weight that marriage had forced both of them to carry. 19 years of building, adjusting, rebuilding, and trying again. And finally, a slow drift that neither could reverse. So what does the saga of Keith Urban and Nicole Kidman really show us? Something that famous couples almost never let us see clearly. How much constant effort even a loving marriage demands, and how quietly distance grows when life keeps yanking two people in opposite directions. That AFI speech wasn't an act. The marriage wasn't fake. The love between them, by all accounts, was real the whole time. And still, none of it was enough to hold forever. For anyone who followed them over those 19 years, that's the most honest and painful part of the story. Not that they failed, but that they tried so hard for so long, and even that level of commitment couldn't outrun the baggage their relationship was asked to drag from day one. What do you think? Were their careers always going to kill this thing, or could it have ended differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more raw, unfiltered stories from behind the celebrity curtain, hit subscribe and stick with us. Oh, and one more tiny detail worth chewing on when you look at the whole timeline. It's all about the timing. In June 2025, just weeks before Keith Urban quietly slipped out of the family home, Nicole Kidman posted a black and white photo on Instagram to mark their 19th anniversary, along with a warm little caption, "Urban's response?" A single emoji, a detail that looked totally boring at the time, but turned into a massive red flag in hindsight. Their last major public outings together happened that same month, first at the Academy of Country Music Awards in May, then at a FIFA Club World Cup match in Nashville in June. By late summer, they were living apart. Anyone really paying attention to the rhythm of this relationship in those months would have spotted the signals. They were just too quiet for most people to notice, until the divorce filing made it impossible to look away. Urban's decision to give that AFI speech in April 2024, to stand in a room packed with Hollywood royalty and plainly admit the worst thing he'd ever done to his own marriage, was an act of shocking transparency. That wasn't some PR manufactured moment. It came from a real place, shaped by genuine gratitude and the knowledge of how close they'd come to imploding before things even got started. What made it complicated? The same speech, if you listened closely, also confirmed just how much this marriage had always depended on Kidman's willingness to absorb and endure. She stayed when most would have run. She rearranged her entire career to support him through treatment. She built a life around a man who, by his own admission, brought something broken into the marriage from day one. For 18 years, that love was enough. And then gradually, with no single dramatic explosion, it wasn't. Kidman's words to Variety in March 2026, "I'm always going to be moving toward what's good," were the most revealing and quietly powerful thing either of them said after the divorce. Not because they explained anything, but because they pointed toward something deeply true about who she had always been in this story. She chose love in 2006 when that was the harder road. She fought for the marriage in 2025 when, by multiple accounts, she wasn't the one who wanted it to end. And when it finally did end, she chose not to fight publicly over any of it. She packed up her daughters, flew to Australia for Christmas, stood on a balcony with Sunday and Faith on New Year's Eve, and posted a photo looking out over Sydney Harbor with the caption, "Looking forward into 2026. After everything, that's what dignity looks like. And it's a fitting final image for a woman whose capacity for love, as Urban himself had said less than 2 years earlier, was like no one he had ever met.